The main thrust of this program is to question the validity of the official record of mankind's exploration of the moon. Sending men to the moon and bringing them back safely is widely held to be the greatest technical achievement of mankind so far. In fact, the greatest achievement of the second millennium. But this story of Project Apollo presents an alternative viewpoint. The material you will see uncovers numerous inconsistencies in the official NASA record of manned missions to the moon. The anomalies presented bring into total question whether, over the period of 3 years from 1969, 12 named Apollo astronauts really did travel through deep space and walk upon the surface of our celestial neighbour, the moon. New evidence throws into serious doubt the authenticity of the Apollo record and suggests that NASA hoaxed the photographs taken on the surface of the moon. This aspect of the lunar photography is dealt with in Part 1. In Part 2, we will be looking at the dangers of space radiation that have to be overcome when journeying to and from the moon. And in Part 3, we examine the evolution of the rockets involved and the problems of getting astronauts and all their equipment out to the moon and back, alive and well. This production is the result of painstaking and extensive research. You will hear the testimony of many people from various disciplines, including those who can be described as whistleblowers. These are individuals who have spoken out or left a legacy of clues. In a 1959 report to the US House of Representatives, rocket engineer Wernher von Braun stated that manned orbit of the moon would not occur before 1969, and that a manned lunar landing would only follow years later. The NASA administrators and their contractors, North American Aviation, were firmly of the opinion that until at least the early 1970s, only unmanned instrumentation would be probing the lunar surface and its environment.
In 1959, I was working with advanced research at Rocketdyne, and they did a study on the statistical probability of landing a man on the moon and returning him, and it was something like 0.0014. This was taking into account the Van Allen radiation belt, solar flares, micrometeorites, all of the numerous hazards that astronauts would encounter and the possibility of failure. So obviously, when I heard that in 1959, I pretty much got the idea that going to the moon was a real risky thing.
Despite these and other expert opinions, 2 years later, President Kennedy officially set America on the road to the moon. Given the fully acknowledged relatively primitive state of 1960s technology, we are going to investigate the dramatic progress and the many claims made by the Apollo space program.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
This program will show that real live astronauts were sent on the high-risk journey to the moon, but they were not the now famous named astronauts who in all probability never left Earth orbit. In this way, they avoided exposure to the hazardous and even lethal radiation of deep space by remaining below the zones of radiation that encircle Earth, and of course staying well within the Earth's magnetic field, which contributes to the protection of our planet. Even in our present state of technology at the dawn of this new millennium, potentially lethal radiation awaits all those who venture through the Van Allen radiation belts into deep space, whether they be en route to the moon, to Mars, or beyond. So did Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Ed Mitchell, and their named comrades sacrifice their personal integrity on the altar of NASA's reputation? Did other unnamed astronauts sacrifice their lives? And if so, for what reason? Was it to cover for the fact that in the late 60s it was not possible to guarantee the safe return to Earth of the Apollo astronauts? Such a scenario would answer that inevitable question, why? and to justify the serious anomalies in the official record which this investigation reveals. Dr. Ian Crawford is a research astronomer for the Department of Physics and Astronomy at University College London.
In our history, we've messed up a lot of things, but we have also done some things which are truly great, like building the pyramids, like building the cathedrals in medieval Europe, and like putting people on the moon in the 1960s. I mean, these were tremendous achievements for their time.
Could it be the case that NASA publicly stated that it was doing things one way, when in fact plans were in place to proceed in a very different manner? Was it realized very early on that apart from the unpredictable radiation hazards and the massive technological challenges, the lunar environment itself, without an atmosphere and certainly no winds, created yet another set of insurmountable problems?
Maybe it'll, that sort of looks like it's waving in a breeze. Yes, sir.
How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. Yes, and how many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Like many of us, David Percy was overjoyed at the sight of Armstrong apparently stepping onto the lunar surface in July 1969. David is an award-winning film and television producer, as well as a professional photographer and associate of the Royal Photographic Society.
A representative of mankind may well have gone to the moon in 1969, but our research suggests that images of the Apollo landings are not a true and accurate record of such an event. In our view, the Apollo pictures were faked. Many were also encoded with deliberate mistakes. In the years following the Apollo missions, it became increasingly clear to us that there were also errors in the continuity between the live TV coverage and the still photographs. Many of the images are replete with inconsistencies and anomalies. These anomalies and errors may well have been deliberately introduced by whistleblowers. The view of co-author Mary Bennett and myself is that these whistleblowers were individuals deeply unhappy with the fraud they were perpetrating. They in all likelihood created the errors in the anticipation that one day these mistakes would be discovered and exposed. Now, back in the Apollo days, in order to record the original broadcast material for posterity, it had to be filmed off TV screens during the live enactment of each Apollo mission. Now, following the recently completed transfer of all that film onto videotape, it's now been possible to study this film in its entirety, something, incidentally, that relatively few people have done. And furthermore, there's added irony in the fact that new evidence suggests that the original broadcast material wasn't live at all, but actually consisted of pre-recorded video programming. We've come full circle.
Talk us through an example or two of errors in continuity between the Apollo TV coverage and still photographs of the same event.
A serious continuity error can be found in the last but one mission, Apollo 16 of 1972. Let's take a look at a clear discrepancy in the record. We've dubbed this the jump salute. When the astronaut reaches the peak of his jump, his colleague takes a snap with the Hasselblad stills camera. Let's ignore the reasons as to why such a small jump in the much reduced 1/6 gravity of the moon and continue instead with the discontinuities revealed by these images. This is the resulting Hasselblad photograph of that event. The most significant difference between these two images of the same action is that in the still photo there's a triangle of fabric that should be absolutely secure and motionless that has flapped up from the top of the plis, the personal life support system, as the astronaut jumps into the air. In the TV freeze frame we can see this triangular flap is correctly fastened and is therefore not visible. It's not flapped up. If it had done so, it would be very obvious in this rear view, the TV image. You can see the size and detail of the triangular flap from this view of the top of the plis. How could this part of the vital life support pack not be correctly fastened in place on a real Apollo situation on the Moon? In any event, actions taking place simultaneously, such as TV and stills photography of the same event and the same time, must show the same detail. Both versions cannot be correct. In other words, this piece of TV footage and this still picture cannot possibly have been taken at the same time. This is, in our view, a designer continuity error that cannot have occurred by mistake. The triangular flap would have had to have been intentionally unfastened and hinged upwards and secured in an open position to be visible from the front, as is recorded in the still photograph. Our second example is from Apollo 11 on their way to the Moon, when the craft is allegedly 130,000 miles away from the Earth. This anomalous sequence was also found by a fellow TV producer and Apollo researcher, Bart Zubrell. We're all familiar with the way X-ray pictures are clipped up for examination against the light box. Well, what I'm about to show you is a sequence with a large colour transparency of the Earth clipped up against the window. If I put white behind it, you can see that more clearly. And when it's clipped up against the window, it becomes illuminated by the light of the sun behind it.
Okay, 11, we have a picture. We see the Earth right in the center of the screen, over.
The astronauts are assured that F22 is the correct exposure.
Hi, Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out. And we'll zoom our camera in slowly.
Here is what appears to be the Apollo 11 crew's view of the Earth across the blackness of space.
Roger.
But why would the choice be made to take this all-important first view of Earth from 130,000 miles out by standing well back, away from the window?
Could you describe what you're looking at, over?
Roger, you're seeing Earth as we see it at our left-hand window, just a little more than a half Earth.
During the sequence, after the camera has zoomed in, surprisingly, something comes between the camera and the Earth, partly obscuring the view. Obviously, this could not happen if they were shooting directly out of the window. It would not then be possible for anything to get midway between the camera and the Earth.
Central America. South America becomes invisible just off beyond the terminator or inside the shadow.
And now in this wider view, there's also an interior light in the shot. How can that possibly happen? Well, in fact, all that we've just been looking at was televised live from the craft. But the camera was not looking out through the window at all. Had they been filming the real Earth from a position back from the window, it would be difficult to keep the subject well framed, as you can see from this illustration. The Earth in the far distance would be cut off by the window in the foreground when any movement of the camera occurred. We've ringed the edge of the window white for clarity. Remember, it was handheld. And if they had been filming the real Earth when zoomed in, the edge of the window would not be sharp. It would be out of focus like this and spoil the shot, because the focus would have been set at infinity. Far better to have gone right up to the window and filmed from there.
It's floodlight.
Returning to the sequence where we left off, when the lights have been switched on, the other window shade opened and the exposure adjusted, we can see astronaut Mike Collins. The left-hand window we've just been looking at is now overexposed, but as we get closer, we can see that something is indeed clipped in front of the window. Is it that window-size colour transparency of the Earth, with the sunlight glowing white behind it? It looks very much so. Why would they need to be videoing a picture of the Earth?
Maybe a bigger f-stop might help.
Continuing with the shot, we panned around past Armstrong, who is in the centre of frame, across to the right-hand side of the capsule. And here, would you believe, through the right-hand window is what appears to be the real Earth filling the view. From the Apollo 11 command module, the CSM, we're being shown two different views of Earth, but both cannot be correct. Given that the first version is purporting to be over halfway to the Moon, and on closer examination is seen to be a colour transparency, we have to conclude that this image is not a true representation of the CSM's position. However, the time recorder reads out a mission elapsed time of 34 hours and 16 minutes.
34 hours, 16 minutes, and 15 seconds. Right, you see that clearly enough, Charlie?
Where could they be? Well, as the second view of Earth fills the craft's window, we must conclude that they're in the relative safety of low Earth orbit. and not on their way to the moon at all. That would then explain why they were videoing a picture of the distant Earth. It's worth noting that this star chart, which is obviously clipped to the window, is held there in the same manner as we suggest was the backlit transparency of the Earth we saw earlier.
The President's two star charts that he is using right now as sunshades over the right-hand window, window number 5. Roger, we see the sun shining in through it behind him. And
this sequence, then, together with the jump salute, are our first two examples of whistleblowing fakery and indications to us that something's seriously wrong with the Apollo record.
Dr. David Groves is a physicist in the UK and a specialist in image processing.
I've been involved in image analysis for 25 years now. I did my PhD developing holographic computer techniques for analysing images. My company, Quantic Image Processing, use these image processing techniques to extract three-dimensional information from two-dimensional images used in industry and used in medicine. The NASA pictures that I've analysed contain many inconsistencies, a whole core of which have no rational explanation or excuse.
Not surprisingly, a growing number of intelligent thinking people are beginning to realise that all was not well with Apollo. So why aren't professionals in the aerospace industry speaking out? What could be the reason for such reticence? Well, in fact, some have spoken out. Bill Wood lives in California. He is a highly qualified scientist with degrees in mathematics, physics and chemistry. He's been granted high security clearance for a number of tops. Wood has worked with many major contractors to the United States government, including McDonnell Douglas, and also with engineers employed on the Saturn V, the Apollo launch vehicle. For many years, Bill Wood has harboured suspicions regarding the authenticity of the Apollo record.
I think that a lot of the people that I have had contact with in the aerospace industry want desperately to believe that this actually happened, because it's a source of pride that their profession contributed to an achievement like this. And then, of course, within the United States, we're all very proud that our country made this achievement. So there's a real reluctance to question anything that would destroy this lofty self-image. And particularly for the people who worked on the Apollo program, to many of them, this was the most wonderful achievement that they ever produced during their entire life. And they would much rather think of it that way than to think that, like millions of other people, they were fooled into thinking they were working on something that was not genuine.
I think the idea that the Apollo project was faked is demonstrably ridiculous. I think it can be demonstrated that this is the case from a large amount of evidence, both scientific and indeed just common sense.
H.J.P. Arnold is an astronomer and very keen photographer, an expert on space and astrophotography. He was assistant to the managing director of Kodak Limited during the period of Apollo. He's also the author of many books on space photography and exploration.
This is a roll of, as you can see, 70mm film, and this is, of course, I hasten to say it's not the original, which is in the closely guarded and temperature and pressure controlled vaults in Houston, magazine 40 from Apollo 11. So this is the roll of Ektachrome film that was exposed mainly by Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface, and of course it's a historical record, but I do stress that this is a duplicate which was given to me, and I'm very proud to have been given it by the people at the Photographic Technology Division in Houston.
Brian Welch is Acting Director, Media Services at NASA Washington.
The film was specially produced for NASA by Kodak. It involved the use of thin gels and special emulsions for this film. The idea was that it would have to stand up to a vacuum, it would have to stand up to extremes of heat and cold on the surface of the moon.
But H.J.P. Arnold has a completely different view regarding the film used.
It was Kodak film, and the sensitization of the film was essentially the same as ordinary film at that time. It was Ektachrome X, as it was then called, 64 ASA, or ISO, as we need to say now. ASA is all gone. Or 160, which was then a very fast film, of course, at 160 ASA or ISO.
So it turns out that the film emulsion was perfectly ordinary after all. Then perhaps the camera itself was special. Hasselblad in Sweden was the NASA-appointed manufacturer of a camera capable of functioning on the lunar surface, and Jan Lundberg was the project engineer responsible for building the camera.
Originally, NASA made all the alterations themselves. Then they presented what they had done to us and asked, can you do this? And we said, yes, we can, and we can do it better. So after that, we put up a technical specification, which was approved by NASA, and then all the alterations were made in our factory.
Was the film loaded into a regular camera magazine?
It was a modified standard 70mm back. There were protective plates both on the camera and on the film magazine.
On all the NASA still photographs taken by the Hasselblad lunar surface camera, one should see small crosses spread at intervals over the surface of the image. In the centre of the image, there should be a larger crosshair, or reticle as it's called professionally. These reticles were virtually in contact with the film and set in the focal plane of the camera at the time of manufacture by Zeiss. This means they are immovable. Any photograph purporting to be taken on the moon by the named Apollo astronauts using these lunar surface cameras must feature the large reticle at the centre of the picture. Not only that, it would be totally impossible for an object to get in front of the reticle on the developed image.
So what exactly are these reticles or crosshairs for? What do they do?
They can measure this distance between the crosses and also determine if the film has curved, because then the crosses will be slightly dislocated.
So what is NASA's opinion on the reason for the reticles?
Those are there in those photographs in order to provide the engineers with the ability to measure distances. They would knowing the way the photo was put together, they would be able to use that to measure things off in the distance, and so that's why they're there.
Did the reticles also help to judge distances?
Not actually.
Because that's what NASA says the reticles are for.
Well, to do that you need a stereo pair.
However, the Apollo pictures, those with the reticles, were not taken as stereo pairs. Let us now look at some further basic photographic principles and examine some more of the Apollo photographs to see what anomalies might come to light.
In these Earth pictures of typical tree shadows, notice the parallel lines of shadow on the ground, and also that the shaded side of the trees is very dark, which does not allow for any visible detail. These points are both logical and unsurprising. Now compare the tree shadow pictures with this shot allegedly taken on the moon. This is the designated landing site of Apollo 14. The area where the LEM is located is virtually flat. But one can calculate from the diverging shadows that the source of the illumination is within the area of the scene itself, apparently overhead. In other words, it cannot be the sun. It's possible to work out exactly where the light source was positioned, because the shadows diverge from a point here, when in fact the shadows ought to be parallel. The sun creates parallel shadows. The shadows cast by the rocks in the foreground should have been east-west, like the LEM shadow here. When natural sunlight is illuminating objects on flat terrain, this result is impossible, but this result is consistent with illumination from a closely positioned artificial source of light.
Should we then take this matter of artificial lighting very seriously?
Yes, because according to the official record, no artificial lighting whatsoever was taken to the moon. Compare NASA's photograph with our computer-simulated image. The light source, the sun, in our simulation is located far to the west, the left-hand side of your screen. And in our illustration, all the shadows are falling, naturally, due east. We must therefore irrefutably conclude that an artificial light source was used in close proximity to this alleged moon location in order for NASA to obtain the non-parallel shadows seen here in this photograph. Let's go through some more examples. Here is a Honda press advertisement that's used a very interesting mix of shadow directions. For the sake of argument, let us take it that the cars were the primary subject of the photograph, So they were the beneficiaries of the prime source of natural light, the sun. And the very, very short shadows created by the cars themselves indicate that these were photographed near to midday. The sun's direction is from the bottom right-hand corner. The palm trees, however, have been photographed when the sun was further round, nearer to setting, and therefore creating these very long shadows due to the sun's closeness to the horizon. This is an example of a composite picture containing two differing sets of shadows, a composite that incorporates the message that there have been time delays between the components that make up the final result. For Honda's purposes, this discrepancy doesn't matter. But to see the same type of composite manifesting in the official record of Apollo is more than enough to alert us to the fact that something's very wrong.
Can you then give an example of this from an Apollo mission?
Yes. Crossing to Apollo 17, here is a picture of Jack Schmitt digging. His shadow is extending in the same direction as that of the cars we've just been looking at. The source of light is from the bottom right-hand corner of this picture. Yet if we look towards the right of the scene, we can see that the shadows of the middle distance rocks themselves run from east to west, shown here by the green lines, the secondary light source. The yellow lines indicate the direction of the primary light source, allegedly the sun. Now this situation is impossible naturally, and has to be the result of more than one light source and/or technical manipulation and doctoring of the image. If we look at the shadows of the rover's wheels in this photo, we can see that they are somewhat diverging, as shown here by the lines, and as we tilt down we can see that this rock here, halfway down the picture on the right-hand side, is producing a shadow that extends diagonally to the lower part of the picture, as is the shadow for the foreground rock. The rock with the letter C marked on it, originally noticed by fellow researcher Ralph Rene. Let's pause here for a moment and ask why there should be a letter of the English alphabet stamped onto a rock on the moon's surface, and why there's a C also marked on the ground just in front of this very peculiar looking rock. How could this be? Surely we're looking at the deliberate planting of props on a previously designated portion in the foreground of a photographic film set. Does this planted C stand for centre, or is it perhaps C for light, artificial or otherwise? For this is the letter that represents the physical constant of the speed of light as it's presently understood. If early probe images from the moon had demonstrated that natural lighting conditions there would not reproduce consistently acceptable results due to the gravitational anomalies and possible variations in the behaviour of light, the subsequent use of artificial lighting in the pre-creation of the lunar surface imagery makes a lot of sense, as does this whistleblowing clue.
The fact that the speed of light may not be a constant is only just beginning to be discussed openly beyond scientific circles, but of course variations of light speed at specific periods have been observed over the years. It could well be that the speed of light varies according to local gravity fields.
Coming back to shadow anomalies, here is an example of a Mongolian herdsman, photographed with the light behind him. And of course, if a photographer is exposing for this scene, he or she knows perfectly well that without the use of fill-in flash or other lighting near the camera, there's going to be a result that looks more like a silhouette. Now look at this picture of an astronaut spacesuit, which was taken in a studio. The prime or key light is from the right, the upper area of the picture, and the area by the shoulder, here on the left, is much darker. So parts of the subject have been filled in with light in order to give us more detail. And indeed this fill-in light is square in shape and has been reflected by the visor. We propose that this technique of using extra fill-in light was applied when certain Apollo close-ups were created. Here we have the sun, allegedly the only lighting source available to all lunar photographers, directly behind the astronaut and directly behind the rover. And remembering our example of the Mongolian herdsman, with no extra lighting and no atmosphere to help diffuse the light and fill in the subject, we must expect the authentic lunar surface picture to look like this, with both the astronaut and the rover in silhouette. Yet in this NASA moon photograph, as published, we can see detail on the shadow side of the astronaut. To say this once more, such detail can only be revealed by the use of an additional light source. So we have to conclude that secondary lighting was used to create these alleged lunar surface pictures.
Were any lights used in the lunar surface photographs?
No. They had no extra light sources brought with them.
At this point, let's consider some of the important initial imagery allegedly taken on the surface of the Moon by the Apollo 11 astronauts. Another individual named Bill Wood, working at Goldstone Tracking Station in California, played an important role throughout Project Apollo in delivering the communication links to and from the spacecraft. What were conditions like on the lunar surface at the time of the Apollo 11 moonwalk, or EVA? And if it was so dark in the shadow of the lunar module, the LEM, did they, for instance, use a special low-light lens on the camera?
Astronauts would go down the ladder essentially in deep shadow. They would only be illuminated by something reflecting off of, light reflecting off of something else. And I believe that they felt that they needed as much light gathering power as possible. That was the lens that was used on Apollo 11, the so-called night lens.
If the Apollo 11 TV footage was taken using a night lens, then what about the still photographs? We have to ask how they produce such good results, because the stills camera was not specifically designed for low light conditions, and the camera was not fitted with a special night lens.
In the Moon, where you have no atmosphere, shadow is black and highlight is really violent highlight, so you have an enormous contrast problem.
We're reliably informed, to emphasize this point again, that no extra lighting was taken to the Moon. We've taken the TV coverage and intercut the relevant still pictures.
Okay, your bliss looks like it's clear and okay. But those are about to come over the sill.
This is the first of a sequence of photographs of Aldrin descending the ladder, taken by Neil Armstrong during Apollo 11.
Now drop your bliss down. There you go, you're clear.
A number of sources, as well as the many reference books on the subject, emphasize that the shadow side of the LEM was in total darkness, and this fact is also confirmed by the TV coverage itself. You could call it designer gloom in comparison with the still photos. In this still picture sequence, Aldrin is apparently lit. In other words, an artificial light source has turned what would otherwise have been unusable, gloomy pictures into images of virtual studio-like quality.
Visibility, as we've said before, is not too great. Okay, I'm on the top step and I can look down over the RCU and landing gear pad. Okay, I'm going to leave that 1 foot up there and both hands down about the 4th rung up.
So here we have Aldrin, descending the ladder in total shadow. But we have evidence of the use of artificial lighting in the still photos of the event, because we can see that lighting is hitting part of the porch, the backpack, part of Aldrin's spacesuit. And most notably, it is hitting the heel protector of his right boot. It is obvious to anyone who understands photography that secondary lighting was used in this image. Reflectivity of the lunar surface, incidentally, is so low that it doesn't even manage to illuminate the rocks on the surface near to the ground. So we cannot accept the argument that the astronauts are beautifully lit even into the porch area of the LEM due to lunar surface reflectivity.
I think the idea that the Apollo photographs were faked is extremely unlikely. I think you have to remember there were 6 successful manned Apollo landings. So the idea, if something had gone wrong in the first one, then of course it would be pretty simple to fix it for the other ones. The other thing you have to remember is, although there are 2 or 3 perhaps really famous photographs from the Apollo project that most people are familiar with, really tens of thousands of photographic images were obtained from the surface of the Moon during those missions. So the idea that they were all faked really seems pretty unlikely. And to be honest, it would be extremely difficult to fake those photographs because the environmental conditions on the Moon are really different from the environmental conditions on the Earth, or even different from the environmental conditions you could easily duplicate in a studio.
David Groves of Quantec Image Processing, using the technological resources at his command, has traced this secondary light source and been able to calculate exactly where an additional light was placed in relation to the camera.
If you magnify the photograph and look at the boundary of the porch through which the astronaut is exiting, you can see a fine shadow line around the porch perimeter. This shadow line shows that you have a well-localized source of light to the right of the camera. Most interestingly, there is a hot spot on the heel protector of the astronaut's right-hand boot. This allows us to do some quantitative measurement. We had access to one of these boots with a heel protector from which we could measure very accurately the curvature of that heel protector. Knowing again the focal length of the camera lens, the position of that hotspot on the heel protector and the orientation of the boot in the photograph, we could determine the light path to that source of illumination. The light source is between 24 and 36 centimeters to the right of the camera, an ideal position for artificial lighting.
So it's now been established beyond argument that an artificial light source was used. We even know where it was placed for the photography of this important sequence of Aldrin descending the ladder. At this point you might say, well, surely they can use extra lighting if they want to. What's wrong with that?
According to NASA, the astronauts didn't take any lighting to the moon. And we can prove that there was no lighting. The TV coverage of this event demonstrates this fact. In the TV footage, we can see Armstrong standing at the foot of the ladder as Aldrin descends, supposedly taking the still photos which are the official record of this event. Aldrin is in darkness. Aldrin is not lit. Yet the published still photo sequence clearly indicates the use of an artificial light source. Did Armstrong really take these still photos during Aldrin's descent on the moon? In our opinion, probably not. We propose that this is a completely restaged, or rather pre-staged, set of studio photographs.
So, wherever the Aldrin descending the ladder sequence of stills was taken, an artificial source of light was deployed.
I know that they had no extra lightning, no flashes or things like that. So it has to be the reflection from the surface.
That the astronaut will be adequately lit whilst in the shadow side of the LEM solely from natural light or earthshine bouncing off the lunar surface is an argument advanced by others as well as Jan Lundberg, but it's untenable. To make a direct comparison, the surface of the moon on average has the ability to reflect light from any source whatsoever at whatever distance from its surface to the same degree as asphalt does on Earth, on average approximately 7%. In other words, whatever the strength of the light arriving on the lunar surface, whether by natural or other means, the ability of the average lunar surface to reflect light remains constant. Indeed, the lunar surface luminosity is so low it doesn't even manage to illuminate the shadow side of the smallest rocks, as we've already seen. Here's another good example. The sun, or prime light source, is behind the LEM. This picture is taken into the light, so the side of the craft nearest to us should be absolutely black, but has been filled in with a generous amount of light. Particularly obvious is this piece of equipment illuminated from the front.
That sequence of images on the lunar surface, taken mainly by Armstrong, of course, with that one camera, which was incidentally left on the moon, so it's going to be a marvellous relic for when we eventually get back there, of course. The film came back. That film, probably, I would say, has never ever been bettered, whether on the moon or subsequently. Almost every one of those relatively small number of images taken by Armstrong appeared to be splendidly composed. You remember the classic face-on picture of Aldrin with his visor reflecting the entire landing scene, the lunar module, the flag, the TV camera, and Armstrong taking the picture reflected in the visor. It's a marvellous picture.
With that comment, H.J.P. Arnold has led us to another of the classic Apollo 11 images. In fact, one could say that this particular shot conveys the very essence of the entire Apollo program. Yet this classic picture of Aldrin has several very serious problems.
Aldrin cannot be standing in natural sunlight in this image because the surface around him is not evenly lit, as would be the case with light from the sun. This scene is obviously lit with uneven artificial lighting. The prime source of light is over Aldrin's left shoulder. The light is emanating from this direction. We know this is so because we can see what photographers call fall-off in the top left, the top right, and the left foreground. This fall-off effect is the name given to darker areas caused by lighting a subject with a non-uniform source of light, lighting that does not have enough spread, as this false colour version particularly reveals. Secondly, we can see that our old friend the fill-in light has again been used to illuminate the suit detail on Aldrin's right-hand side, the left of the picture.
On the face of it, there doesn't seem to be anything particularly strange about this image to me. The sun is over behind the guy's left shoulder. He's casting an image, a shadow moving to bottom left, as you would expect. The astronaut himself, you can see, because of although he's not in direct sunlight, the direct sunlight is on his back. He's being illuminated by reflected light from the foreground.
Remember, our claim is that the fill light is artificial. The camera position itself is also in doubt, for we seem to be looking down on the astronaut. How can we tell if that's so? Well, recalling the large centre reticle cannot be anywhere but in the centre of the image, we're surprised to find that this reticle is over the lower part of Aldrin's right leg. The Hasselblad camera was attached to the astronaut's chest at the time, and so the centre of the image should be over the abdominal area of the subject. This lower leg position for the centre reticle strongly indicates that the camera was in fact positioned at a higher level. As this graphic demonstrates, the centre of the picture can only be over the subject's lower leg if the camera is positioned at eye level and then tilted down. The camera height and tilt angle was calculated by David Groves. This fact represents another serious problem. The reflection of this scene mirrored in the astronaut's visor shows the astrophotographer with his camera clearly positioned at chest level, which actually cannot be. So this false reflection must have been composited or painted in over the original image. The reflection we see in the visor cannot be that of the photographer of the image.
The horizon is a very good datum. On the moon, the horizon effectively acts as a spirit level. We know it's about 89 degrees from the true vertical. Therefore, the position of the horizon cutting through the image of the astronaut shows us the level of the camera when the picture was taken. And if we look at the picture, we can see the horizon cuts very nicely at face level.
And as for the orientation of where the astronaut was, I mean, the moon's surface isn't completely flat. He may well be standing there with with his camera at chest level, and the guy being photographed may be a couple of feet lower down because the ground slopes.
The camera taking the photograph could have been positioned on the chest of an astronaut, and that astronaut could have been about 2 foot higher than the astronaut that was being photographed. To this end, we could analyse the shadow in the image. Basically, the information we have and can make use of is we know the width of the visor in the image, the focal length of the lens used on the camera. Using that information, we can analyse the shadow of the astronaut's left leg and determine between the two astronauts the variation in height of the surface. The variation in height of the surface between the astronauts is typically a few inches. It would have to actually be 2 feet to explain the incorrect positioning of the camera when the image was taken.
I'll be honest with you, I think that's pseudo-scientific, nitpicky claptrap. And again, I don't know why we should spend even a moment trying to judge that.
But as we've seen, there are indeed crucial problems with the photographs. This is the point. The so-described nitpicky, pseudo-scientific claptrap is not pseudo at all. The analysis has been undertaken based on the laws of physics. Fortunately, the information encrypted within these images has survived the voyage across 3 decades and is now being decoded by people like Percy and Groves. The proof is in the detail. It may be uncomfortable for NASA to accept that the warning whistles of these unknown photographic encoders are at long last now being heard.
By the way, the Apollo 11 high camera examples are not isolated ones. Here's a picture of Al Bean of Apollo 12, also taken from too high a camera position. The camera is looking down on the subject, belying the reflection in the visor. Notice the horizon passing right through the centre of the visor. There are further examples from Apollo 11 where the camera position is even higher than that in the classic shot. Here we see Aldrin standing by the LEM with the horizon not cutting through his visor at all, but passing above the height of his helmet. indicating that the camera position was even higher than that of the picture of Albine and the classic photograph itself. Some people have said perhaps they retouched the pictures to bring up the detail of the astronauts, but any retouching of images cannot apply to Apollo 11 pictures. We've examined a duplicate or copy of the roll of film from magazine 40 that purports to come from Armstrong's camera. It's a roll with well over 100 coloured images. Retouched or publicity pictures cannot get into a continuous roll of film. So none of these images can have been retouched unless they've been collectively rephotographed onto a continuous roll under entirely different technical conditions than we've been led to believe.
So what does Hasselblad have to say about this classic Aldrin picture? Does it look to Jan Lundberg as though the subject was lit?
Yes, it seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why? So maybe you have to find Armstrong and ask him.
The most compelling piece of evidence in this photograph is that not the measurements of the height of the camera, but the reticles, the little crosses that are superimposed on the image at the time the photograph is taken. The largest reticle appears at the center. That central position is fixed in the camera. It cannot move. You have to have, with an image, it hasn't been interfered with in any way, that reticule appearing in the center of the image. If we look at this famous photograph, we can see the central reticule towards the bottom of the astronaut's right leg. This is significantly offset from the center of the image. This cannot occur in that position unless the photograph has been copied and reframed.
I don't think this cross here necessarily does indicate the centre of the photograph. There's another cross over here, there's another cross over there. And in fact, NASA photographs you often see have fiducial crosses all over the place to help them orientate themselves.
Why is the centre reticle not in the centre of the image?
The exact answer to the question is I don't really know and haven't even bothered to go find out. And the reason is this is 30-year-old stuff. We mounted this expedition, the expeditions to the moon, almost 30 years ago. And frankly, I had a chance to look over the points that this person was making. I didn't understand them. I don't understand why we should spend the time to go off and do the research to look up, to prove to people that we went to the moon. The fact of the matter is we did go to the moon.
While noting that Brian Welch referred to one single expedition to the moon and then corrected himself, it's interesting that NASA, via its media representative, declares itself not accountable to the public for its actions. This despite the fact that NASA went to the moon for all mankind. And surely the fact that one individual spokesman claims he doesn't understand the questions asked does not in any way invalidate the demand for a proper response and the necessity for a proper response.
The effort involved in trying to fake, one image might not be too bad, but in trying to fake thousands and thousands to assure that you were never discovered over 25 years seems completely implausible to me. It seems a bizarre thing to question something that is so demonstrably part of history just by trying to interpret 2 or 3 photographs when the project was so much deeper than that and affected so many people in so many ways.
This establishment view, albeit not held by everyone, misses the point entirely and is not a reason for ignoring these disturbing findings. The quantity of suspect pictures is not the real issue, it's what these images convey. These pictures have been presented to the entire world as authentic and actual photographs of this most significant event, mankind's first steps onto a planet other than his home. To ignore or dismiss the questions raised by the discovery of even one technically defective photograph purporting to be a part of this official record is to sidestep the issue. However, we'd like to offer the upholders of this status quo viewpoint yet another major challenge. In Western Australia, during the live telecast of Apollo 11 in 1969, many viewers in that region of Australia, including Una Ronald, were to have an extraordinary experience.
when this moon landing was in the offing, I for one decided to stay up to watch the live telecast, and I did, and we saw a lot of activity on the television screen from the control centre, a lot of anticipation, a lot of excitement.
But before we get to what happens next, we need to know how the TV coverage of Apollo 11 was supposed to have reached our screens.
Just shortly before Armstrong stepped on the moon, you can actually see the switch take place where it goes from this stark black and white to a little better. And they stayed with the television signal from Honeysuckle Creek. So when Armstrong stepped on the surface of the moon, it actually came through Australia, but at the time it was reported as being through Goldstone. The voice came through Goldstone, but the TV pictures came from Australia.
It appears that correct information was apparently withheld at the time as to what was supposed to be happening with Apollo 11's reception.
As I watched this person walking, a Coke bottle in the lower right quadrant of the screen, it seemed to be kicked over and rolled across. And for me that was just astounding, and I exclaimed aloud at the time, "It's a fake, it's a setup, they're not on the moon at all, look at this, it's a Coke bottle." And they were going to broadcast the same film again in the morning, and I phoned several of my friends, "Did you watch? And they hadn't, but they were going to watch in the morning. And I waited, of course, to say, "Well, did you see it?" But it didn't happen. I watched the second telecast. There was no Coke bottle, which led me to believe at the time that it must have been edited out. I was convinced it was fake, but why? Why it should be fake? Why such a setup? 2 or 3 others of my acquaintance did see it. And furthermore, there were letters written to the West Australian newspaper. They mentioned the Coke bottle. And I waited for it to brew up. I thought, my goodness, there's going to be a glorious ding-dong here going on about this Coke bottle. But suddenly there was nothing at all. And I presume that those who saw it denied their own senses, as people will do. Began to think, well, they couldn't have seen it, or perhaps it was there and that was okay. They'd thrown some rubbish out of the spacecraft or something like that. It could have been. People will invent all kinds of solutions to what is not explained.
What Una Ronald and her friends did not know was that Western Australia was a special case concerning the reception of the initial Apollo images. Contrary to the procedure for that continent set up by Honeysuckle Creek and Parkes, together with NASA and Australian TV, the Apollo 11 images were neither sent directly to Western Australia via satellite, nor was there a broadband link from Sydney in 1969. These images had to be sent over to Perth from Sydney by other means and then retransmitted locally. So for an engineer in the loop, aware of the hoaxed live TV coverage, there was motive for adding further additions to the scene. Moreover, here was an opportunity for someone in the know to manipulate the material before transmission across Western Australia. Bill Kaysing is a science writer and was head of technical publications in the Propulsion Field Labs in California from 1956 to 1963. He was employed by Rocketdyne, contractors to NASA who built the Saturn V rocket and the command and service module.
I was very much in on testing and edited and wrote technical reports on testing and, of course, witness tests.
So what is Bill Kaysing's view of what actually happened during Apollo?
As I see it, NASA and other connected agencies knew that they couldn't get to the moon and back. All right, they had to simulate it. So to do this, they went to, say, agencies like ARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency in Massachusetts. They're connected with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I have worked for ARPA, and I know that they have the highest level scientists. So NASA and NSA and other assorted agencies went to MIT and said, okay, this is a super secret project, tell us how we can simulate it. To create a simulation is really not all that difficult, because if all the input comes from NASA and goes to NASA, and you knew that was the case, all Apollo communications were handled from and to NASA. So they had complete control.
Once the astronauts had been launched, it was no longer possible to verify the authenticity of any communication. In the case of major news stories here on Earth, journalists witness and comment on news events, and reports have to be confirmed before going to press. The Apollo communication links were controlled by none other than NASA itself. In these circumstances, how could we know for sure that the images from NASA were those of events that were actually occurring at that moment? Given the unique distribution method reserved for this region of Australia, was that Coke bottle incident a very discreet marker on the official record, a blow on the whistle that at the time would go undetected by Houston? What was really involved in the lunar surface photography? How would the Apollo pictures be taken by the astrophotographers?
Typically, they either had a table of settings for certain subjects at certain sun angles, or it was usually presented as a wheel or a circle, a clock face if you like, where for a given shutter speed they would have a series of apertures around the sides of the dial instead of 1, 2, 3 o'clock, etc.
But how were the necessary adjustments made so they could be sure of obtaining the correct exposures?
They had a lot of practice so they could feel what the setting was, because once on the moon, on the lunar surface, in the dress, in the life support system, you couldn't see the camera. They couldn't bend their head that far down to see the scales. Maybe they could see the aperture scale, which was in the front, but not the rest. They had no viewfinder, they had to aim by moving their body.
They had to effectively guess where they were pointing the camera, but since they were using a wide-angle lens on the lunar surface, it wasn't really too much of a guess, because broadly pointing the camera fixed to their chest in the direction they would encompass the subject in which they were interested.
I'm going to run off a couple, John.
Needed where the sun is shining on what they want to see.
Houston, how's that field of view?
Our own research has ascertained that composing pictures under these conditions and getting the camera pointing in the right direction isn't actually that easy.
Neil, this is Houston. The field of view is okay. We'd like you to aim it a little bit more to the right, over.
Here, the TV camera couldn't be lined up on the Apollo 11 LEM without assistance from base. Even with Houston's essential guidance, lining up the camera is obviously very difficult to achieve.
I'll start working on the solar.
A little bit too much to the right. Can you bring it back left about 4 or 5 degrees? Roger, you look okay as far as distance goes, Neil, and we'll line you up again when you finish the panorama. You're going too fast on the panorama sweep. You're going to have to stop for a final orientation. We'd like it to come left about 5 degrees, over.
So we wonder how they managed to take such good, well-composed, studio-quality pictures using the Lunar Hasselblad without a viewfinder and without Houston to guide them when lining up the camera.
Back to the right about half as much.
Okay.
Okay, that looks good there, Neil.
Was it intended that they should change lenses, filters and magazines outside, with the potential of dropping them into the dust, rendering them unusable?
So once they went out, they had one set for this particular mission, and then they went back in, changed whatever they needed to change, for instance, film magazines or lenses, and then they went out again.
Okay, Houston, I'm going to change lenses on you.
Roger, Neil.
But going inside each time is not what actually happened. These operations took place outside the LEM.
Okay, Houston, tell me, get a new picture.
Neil, this is Houston. That's affirmative. We're getting a new picture. You can tell it's a longer focal length lens.
think they got to rush through what we've got.
Okay, magazine delta is working, and I'm starting with frame count number, about 1.
Okay.
There was always a problem with these things, remember, because they were wearing these very awkward gauntlets.
These already difficult manipulations of the camera equipment would have been made even more difficult due to the astronauts' heavy pressurized gauntlets, like this and this. Wearing these pressurized gauntlets, it would have been virtually impossible to bend the fingers and grab hold of a magazine slide, change lenses or whatever else. There were no oversized tabs on the camera to make adjustments, and only normal size scales.
The gloves were built that they couldn't grip anything smaller than about an inch. They had very bad feeling on the fingertips.
Were these thimble-tipped pressurized gloves, or rather gauntlets, actually the ones used? In the TV footage, these gauntlets look totally unpressurized and more like sturdy gardening gloves. Using unpressurized gardening-type gloves would explain how the astronauts in the TV coverage managed to manipulate the Hasselblad and imaging equipment.
And even supposing that their gloved fingers dealt efficiently with these technicalities, remembering that the Apollo 11 moonwalk was very brief and that the Hasselblad actually had no viewfinder, how did they manage to get such professionally composed pictures? Pictures that resemble the classic pack shots we see created by the top advertising agencies.
Here we're into the realms of the seeing eye. Undoubtedly, there were some of the astronauts who, despite all of the pressures on them, and the fact you're wearing a helmet and a visor and you can't look through a nice screen or viewfinder at all, could see a picture when it occurred to them.
This picture from Apollo 15 can only be described as a good example of a typical advertising pack shot. Everything is perfectly arranged to sell the product. In this instance, that product is NASA's program. We have the astronaut filled in with light, so we don't get a rather disappointing and ghastly silhouette. He's standing just adjacent to the American flag, beautifully backlit and glowing, planted so that it slightly overlaps the lem, thus leading the eye across the picture. And of course the lem just happens to be photographed in such a way that its promotional logo is towards the camera. The rover itself then slightly overlaps the lem, delivering altogether an excellently composed picture, in no way consistent with the mere snapshot of random objects. Such an excellent image would be ideal for future use as general publicity, and in fact was used subsequently for posters and postcards. This is emphatically not a casual photograph of a saluting astro colleague who just happened to be standing, as luck would have it, in the right place at the right moment. This is a plan set up